Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's EKU Chautauqua presentation with acclaimed science, technology, and conservation writer and intrepid journalist, MR, also known as Maura O'Connor. My name is Eric Liddell, Chautauqua Lecture Series Coordinator, and I am delighted and honored on behalf of everyone here at Eastern Kentucky University to welcome you here tonight, Maura, and we thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Also introduce and thank my colleague, Dr. Kelly Carmine, Professor of Anthropology, who, as you see, is joining us on screen for the discussion and Q&A portion of tonight's event following Maura's presentation. And to that end, in just a moment, I will hand things over to Maura, and Kelly and I will return afterwards. And viewers out there, hello, everyone. I can see you already saying hi, Fred and Whitney and Alexandria, Heather, Nicole, Ashley, Lester, etc. You are all invited and encouraged to comment and submit questions right there in the YouTube chat. And we will do our best to get to as many of those as we can as time allows. Oh, I see there's a question now. Is the video appearing? You should be able to see it. My wife's in the other room. She'll let me know streaming problem, but it looks good to me from here. So I'm going to continue. And my wife says hi. So I think everything's good. In any case, back to our event. You can find Maura O'Connor's full biography in the notes below. So I will just accent a few things here. Maura is a graduate of the distinguished Columbia School of Journalism, who writes about politics and ethics of science, technology, and conservation. And she's the author of two books on the cutting edges, of contemporary scientific research, including Resurrection Science, Conservation, De-extinction, and the Precarious Future of Wild Things from 2015, as well as, of course, Wayfinding, the Science and Mystery of How Humans Navigate the World from 2019, both from St. Martin's Press. And Wayfinding explores navigation traditions, neuroscience, and the human relationship to space, time, and memory. And that, of course, is the topic of her talk tonight. A perfect fit for this year's theme, adding especially, as we were talking behind the scene here before we came on tonight, to Wade Davis's series opening presentation back in September. Maura's current book project, called Ignition, is about fire ecology and prescribed, for which she recently became certified as a wildland firefighter. I told you she was intrepid. Her work has appeared in such venues as Slate, Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, Nautilus, and Harper's, among other places. So welcome again, Maura O'Connor, to EKU Chautauqua, and thank you so much for being here. At this point, we'll turn it over to you and step off screen, and we'll see you at the conclusion of your presentation. So I know you have a screen shared, so go ahead and get that started.
All right, how's that looking?
I think you're good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate this invitation and an opportunity to come speak with you. I didn't mention this before, but I actually have this very personal connection to the Chautauqua Institute, the original lecture series in upstate New York, because my grandfather ran the Star Cafeteria there every summer during the lecture series. So I have a lot of pictures of my great grandma. That's my mom and my great grandma, who is Slovakian, at the Star Cafeteria. And I just grew up hearing stories about them working there all together as a family, 3 generations. So it was pretty neat to get an invitation to speak, which I'm sure my grandparents and great grandma probably didn't expect would ever happen. So that's great. So yeah, I'm a science journalist. And like most of my reporting, my book Wayfinding started with a question that I was asking myself at the top of a cliff overlooking the Rio Grande in New Mexico. So basically, I wanted to go to a hot spring in the Rio Grande. I put in the name of that hot spring into my smartphone and then follow the directions down a dirt road to the top of a cliff. And I'm sure the hot spring was somewhere below me, but I couldn't access it in any way that, wasn't going to be fatal. And I just started thinking about my phone and how I was using it to find my way, and why I hadn't stopped to ask a person for directions, someone who had local knowledge and local experience. And that experience kind of sat with me for a long time. And I started asking other questions, which was, how had we so quickly made a transition from paper maps to phones? And then sort of bigger questions, like how had we transitioned to paper maps, and what had been there before, and how did people find their way before maps, because obviously maps weren't always around. So these questions started me on a path into neuroscience and anthropology, and I'm going to share some of that with you tonight. Before I start answering some of those questions, I'd love to kind of do a memory exercise with people in the audience. And basically, if you just stick with this, I think it's interesting. I'd just love for you to think about how you got to where you are right now, in the literal sense, where you're sitting right now. Whether it's your home, how did you get home today? If you're at the office, how did you get to the office? What roads did you take? Did you drive a car? Did you walk? So if you just think about that, just the trip that you took to get where you are. And then the second sort of memory exercise I'd love for you to do is to go back in time and to recall one of your childhood birthdays. It could be anyone that you can remember. And just, if you can, close your eyes even, and just try to conjure what that looked like, where it took place, what kind of cake there was, who was there, maybe what presents did you get. So all of these things that you are hopefully able to conjure in your so-called mind's eye are the result of a place called the hippocampus. And in front of you right now is a mouse hippocampus that's been illuminated in this really sort of brilliant way with these rainbow colors. The hippocampus is the place in our brains that's responsible for spatial memory as well as episodic memory. So episodic memory is our sort of autobiographical recollection of the past. It's the locus of our autobiography. It's also, the hippocampus, the place that's responsible for imagining the future. So if we had sort of gone further with that exercise and I said, okay, now picture where you're going to be this summer and what activities you'll be doing and who you'll be seeing, all of those images that might come to you would also be activating this part of your brain. And here you can just see the hippocampus, where it's located. I think it's kind of interesting. And this is a man by the name of Henry Mullison. He was known as the patient HM for most of his lifetime. He is one of the most famous cases of amnesia in scientific literature, and he passed in 2008, but he still remains one of the most famous case studies. He was an epileptic in the 1950s, and at the age of 27, he had part of his temporal lobes removed. And what happened was that he lost his ability to acquire and recollect memories. He actually described his conscious experience as like waking from a dream constantly. And he was forever in a new place. So for instance, it took him years to memorize the floor plan of his own house. He spent a lot of time at MIT, where different neuroscientists conducted tests and tried to understand why the removal of his temporal lobes had resulted in this condition. And it was him that led them to identify the hippocampus as the source of episodic memory. So here's another closer up of the cells in the hippocampus. And in the 1970s, a neuroscientist by the name of John O'Keefe, he was trying to insert an electrode into a rat's thalamus, but he actually used the wrong coordinates, and he ended up inserting it into the rat's hippocampus, although he didn't know it at the time. So when the electrode began recording the firing of this cell, the pattern of that firing struck him as highly unusual. It seemed to be strongly correlated to the rat's location in space. So O'Keefe ended up calling these cells place cells. And he believed that they proved a kind of obscure theory that had been put forth almost half a century earlier, that humans have something called a cognitive map in the brain. And he believed that the map was in the hippocampus, and the purpose of it was to construct models of the physical universe. O'Keefe ended up winning a Nobel Prize for this work, and it has since become an incredible field of neuroscience. There's all sorts of cells that have been since discovered in the hippocampus, in addition to place cells, grid cells, and so on. This is an image taken from the Mullison lab at MIT, and you can go onto YouTube at some point if you want and watch some of these experiments. So if you look down in the lower corner where these light green sort of squares, this is where the rat would have started walking through this, this maze. And each of these colored squares represents the firing of a place cell. And you can see as it moves through this maze, the different cells are firing. So it's really interesting. You can watch this video and see how these cells fire and quote unquote map space. So I became really interested in whether or not this explanation of spatial memory in the brain explains the different kinds of navigation that are documented and explored by anthropologists. We see a lot of descriptions in the literature of the 19th and early 20th centuries of people who are able to find their way through quote unquote featureless landscapes without any use of material maps. And these abilities were always described as sort of magical and mysterious. How is it that they could recall precise locations, identify them, remember them, and communicate them without the use of maps, and find their way through, say, the snowy Arctic or the South Pacific or a quote unquote featureless desert. And then Charles Darwin, who's here, was one of the people who sort of explained this, this ability of non-industrialists by claiming that they had a sort of unconscious instinct that they used to find their way. And we see these descriptions coming from colonists in India, New Zealand, Russia. Darwin believed that some people were guided by what he called an unerring instinct, and that some part of the brain was specialized for the function of direction. And he saw that as evidence that organisms preserved useful variations of pre-existing instincts. And it eventually became known as the sixth instinct by the early 1900s. And this idea persisted for a really long time. And one reason why is that Europeans by this time had so many aids in navigation, so maps, compasses, watches, roads, that they themselves had forgotten that there were other ways of navigating. And it created this sense of historical amnesia. When in fact, throughout most of human history, navigation without any instruments at all, without maps, was actually the rule. So to start exploring some of these other ways of navigating without the use of material technologies or maps, I started in the Arctic. And one of the first people that I began having conversations with was the anthropologist Claudio Iporta. And he explained to me that in the Arctic, in the Inuit, they use routes that are passed down between generations. Some of these routes become visible as tracks on the snow, but then they disappear in other seasons. But he was the one who told me a good traveler in this place always knows where he or she is despite the season. And what he said was it's an example of a memoryscape, a mental image of a place in the environment that's remembered and shared among people. So I went to the Arctic, I went to Nunavut to try and have conversations with people who traverse this sort of landscape and are highly skilled navigators. And one of the first people that I was able to meet was a man by the name of Solomon Awa. He's the 8th child of parents who were born and lived on the land. All of his siblings, all 10 of them, except for him, had to go to residential schools. His parents actually offered the Canadian government 2 of their other children in exchange for the ability to keep Solomon at home so that he could learn how to hunt and to live on the land and to navigate. So Solomon is a incredibly skilled hunter and navigator, and he began showing me and describing to me the ways in which he was able to find his way through this quote unquote featureless landscape, the wilderness of the Arctic. And one of them is something called Ouk Cholae. These are tongue-shaped formations that are found on sea ice, and they're created by dominant winds. And so this is a really great example of how an ability to attend to perceive the environment and simply pay attention offers you all kinds of clues and information that can then be used to find your way. Once you know what the dominant wind is in the area that you are and you see shapes like this in the ground, it's almost impossible to get lost, even if you were in a space with a time of 0 visibility, say for a snowstorm. You could look down on the ground. You don't need the sun or the stars. You have a compass right there in the snow. So Awa told me, you know, when you leave the community, you watch the tongues and which way you are cutting across them. And when you want to come back home, you do it the opposite way. So if you're cutting straight up when you're leaving, then you cut straight down when you return. And so he described a lot of techniques such as this one, and they would include stars, stones, different formations in the snow, which they have, you know, different terms for. The most important thing that Solomon told me was memory. So how he explained it was that Inuit people have an ability to commit a staggering amount of information, visual information, to memory, and that people know places like the back of their hands. He said that some don't even need to see these places, they just need to hear about them. For instance, he had a friend who drove 250 miles to a place called Pond Inlet, and he had never been there before, but he heard someone else give a description of the route that he should take and then was able to successfully go there himself. So he said to me, for instance, if someone like me goes up out on the land traveling, everything is going to look the same. This rock isn't going to look any different from another rock. But he said, if you watch very closely, this place has a big rock, this other place looks the same, but it doesn't have the same big rock. So you have to watch for the details. And this was something that I saw repeatedly in Nunavut, was an ability to commit even the tiniest details to memory, tiny insofar as it could be the lichen, the shape of lichen on a rock. And then that could become a landmark in order to find one's way back. So he also told me that the words that they're taught, the stories, that they put them in their memory, and the land and the visuals, we put them in our memory. And he accredited this ability to recall so much and to put these things in their memory to oral history. The fact that traditionally Inuit culture is an oral culture, and from the time that they're young, they are listening, hearing, and recording information or that's being handed down orally. So another place that I went to for the book was Australia, and I did not take this picture, but this is a picture of a desert in central Australia, and one of the people who had written about Australian Aboriginal navigation was a guy by the name of David Lewis. In 1972, he went to the Simpson Desert in Australia. He was a sailor. He had grown up in New Zealand, and he had just spent the previous 7 years studying and writing about South Pacific maritime navigation. But he wanted to go to Australia and understand Aboriginal navigation practices. And what he found there was really surprising and not what he expected. He found that people he traveled with in the desert rarely, if ever, seemed to use external guides to find their way. And yet they could go places and long distances with incredible accuracy. He said in one of his journal articles that was published afterwards, was all of my preconceived ideas of land navigation turned out to be wrong. In place of the stars, winds, and waves that guide Pacific Island canoemen, the main reference proved to be the meandering tracks of the ancestral Dreamtime beings that form a network over the whole Western desert. So there's this stereotype that I think endures to a certain extent of Aboriginal people as sort of wandering through the desert in search of food and water. Certainly that was the stereotype that colonists in Australia were pretty interested in perpetuating, and mainly because they had an investment in this idea that Indigenous people of Australia had no established territories or ownership over the land, and that it was, in essence, a wilderness that needed to be tamed. This, in fact, as Lewis found out, and many now understand, was completely untrue. Nothing could have been further from the truth. In fact, everything in Australia on the landscape, so rocks, trees, gorges, springs like this one, escarpments, were created by the direct ancestors of Aboriginals who traveled the world in the so-called Dreamtime. And these movements are recorded in songs that are inherited by individuals, and they learn and memorize these songs throughout their lifetime. The songs not only encode ecological knowledge and laws, but also, and what I was most interested in, navigational information, the sequences of these ancestors' movements. So I went and met a man named Bill Harney, also known as Idum Duma. He's a Waterman man. He lives on about 100 square miles of his ancestral territory called Mengen near Katherine, Australia. And he told me, you know, he grew up with the song. He said, we sit down, we know exactly what name is of our places. We know where we're going. He said, quote, we sing like we know exactly where all of these places are. We name them, the routes to travel right to the ends of the songs. Yeah, I sing one and I follow my dreaming, and my dreaming stops and another dreaming goes on. This is another person that I met near Katherine, Australia. The woman in the blue dress is a Jawoyn elder. Her name's Margaret Katherine. And she spent her childhood walking in her traditional country near the Man River. And on this day, we were sitting on this blanket, and I was asking her questions about navigation. And, you know, she was drawing in my notebook and explaining how they could use termite hills, which are oriented in a north-south direction. She was describing using the stars. And I actually asked Margaret, you know, what she did when she got lost in the bush. And she just kind of laughed, because to her, I think this idea of it even being possible to get lost in one's own homeland was sort of silly. And this conversation kind of further expanded, my whole notion of what navigation was and what it means to explore a place. Because you would think, or I thought that, the ability to become lost is sort of a human universal. And yet what she seemed to be pointing to was that this is actually sort of culturally relative, that the experience of being lost and the idea that one might really depend on the culture that you grew up in, and the places that you live, and that this wasn't necessarily universal at all. One of the people who really helped me understand and explore that idea further was a man by the name of Thomas Gridlock, an anthropologist. He had spent many years with the San and the Kalahari, and he writes about how the San do something called topographical gossip. And it's just basically an incredible amount of discussion that takes place between people about where they're going, where they came from. And it's one of the sort of devices that he argues they used that helps them be such incredibly accurate navigators in the desert landscape. And what Whitlock said to me was that, trying to chart an area that you don't yet know is actually a very specific historical situation. He said, quote, "It's a skill that's useful for imperialists wanting to create colonies. And likewise, GPS is also a very useful tool for going into unknown spaces." But what he was saying was that it's a very different mindset, that idea of going into an unknown space, of going into, say, Yosemite and exploring the outdoors. That's very different from what people are doing in Australia or the San or in the Arctic. They're not aspiring to colonize the world and occupy places they've never visited. They're mobile, but they're mobile in this restricted sense. They stay within a more or less defined cosmos. And they're not going into uncharted territory. They're doing something quite different. And that something quite different is really, the heart of what I was exploring in the book Wayfinding. So after meeting these people and having these conversations, I really did start to question whether there is actually a thing of, the cognitive map in the brain. I started to wonder if that was really as settled science as press releases and Nobel Prizes would have us believe, perhaps. So, I found others who dissented from that view. For them, the idea that aspects of the physical world are copied onto an analogous structure in the mind is rather nonsensical. Maps themselves are cultural inventions. They're not objective or independent of a point of view, and they're not equally valid no matter where one stands. And in reality, it's not how most people find their way. As one neuroscientist told me, the map is itself a metaphor. But because we sort of live in this map-saturated culture, particularly in the West, but I would say more so just in the modern times, we're surrounded by maps. We see them on our phones, on our the subway, in an airport. It's kind of the way that we represent spatial information and how we find our way through space. It's easy, I think, to assume that the map describes a mental process. But I found plenty of people who think that, the idea of describing the brain as having a GPS, for instance, which is something that a lot of science journalists put out there, is kind of crazy, and doesn't really make sense at all. That it's sort of a fallacy to use this technology to describe something that's occurring in the brain. And these other, people who dissent from the cognitive map theory really believe that navigation is about a sort of pickup of visual information over time. as we travel through an environment. It's not knowing before we go, but knowing as we go. And, I think about that phrase a lot. I don't know that I have ever completely 100% grasp it, but it's something that's stuck with me. I think about it even when I'm taking a walk through the park. What does it mean to not know before we go, but to know as we go? I think one of the really interesting things about GPS is that if you use it, you need to know where you're going before in order to input that information and then get your directions, your turn-by-turn directions. And there's aspects of the book and conversations I had with people who really feel that's kind of a sad state of affairs, that it kind of eliminates something very exciting and critical about the human experience to always know where we're going before we sort of venture out. So one of the people who definitely was dissenting from the cognitive map theories, the anthropologist Tim Ingold. He as a postdoctoral student was with the Sami in Finland, and as a doctoral student, I should say, but he was with the Sami in Finland, and he found that they navigated by memorizing these sequences of natural landmarks, and they would reverse the sequence in order to find their way back. And he spent several years with them, but he told me that it wasn't until much, much later that he started really thinking about navigation and what it was exactly that they were doing, and then began writing about this idea of wayfinding, which he described as a skilled performance in which the travelers, whose powers of perception and action have been fine-tuned through previous experience, finds his way towards his goal, continually adjusting his movements in response to ongoing perceptual monitoring of his surroundings. I think what was most interesting and inspiring for me talking with Tim was his idea that moving through space is a kind of essential aspect of our being. He said perception happens not because we're minds in bodies, but because we're organisms inhabiting an environment. And paths, like musical melody, unfold over time rather than across space. And music was a metaphor that several people I interviewed for this book brought up again and again. And I think sort of ties into this idea of songlines as mnemonic devices for navigation. Ingold and several others said the much more apt metaphor for navigation, or this idea of wayfinding through space, is not the cognitive map, but the idea of musical melody unfolding. Someone said to me, imagine how you got to work this day, the route that you take. You don't visualize the map and then draw a line of every left and right or north south turn that you took. It's more like how you would hum a song that and I think that is a kind of marvelous way of describing it, and it's something that I also think about a lot. I think the other dimension of navigation that is really exciting and part of my reporting was the idea of navigation as self-determination, and how in some places around the world where navigation was so central to cultural identity and practice and stewardship of the land, those practices were lost, or at least became endangered, and then in recent decades have been resurrected. And this boat in the background with the red sails is called the Ouk Cholae, and it's a traditional sailing canoe from Hawaii. And if anybody is interested in this topic, I would just highly recommend that they go out and read a book about the Ouk Cholae, because it's an incredible story of cross-cultural exchange of Hawaiians who had lost this tradition of navigation and went out to other South Pacific islands and were able to find people who could share their knowledge. And in many South Pacific communities, there's this fight underway to preserve navigation practices. And it's part, I think, of a broader cultural renaissance in language and art and in education. There's people launching educational organizations, sharing knowledge between islands. There's canoeing clubs. The Hokulea helped stave off cultural extinction, and it led to the creation of the Polynesian Voyaging Society. And there's many societies like that in the Cook Islands, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, Tahiti, Tonga, Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands. It's quite amazing. And in these places, practicing navigation traditions is an act of self-determination. And I think, there's individuals who I spoke to for the book who look at a GPS device and just sort of see a tool of colonization, and that this, other way of moving through the world is so central to their identity and language and understanding of their environment is just critical to their future. This is just a really beautiful star compass. Traditionally, it might take an individual decades to master sailing by stars and swell across the ocean using a compass like this, perhaps. One of the amazing women I spoke to in Hawaii was a woman by the name of Kala Tanaka Bebean, and she's a traditional navigator. And one of the points that she made to me was that, some people say that traditional navigators are scientists, but spirituality was a big part of what they did, and a huge part of what she does and what they do, she considers spiritual. And it's quite similar to what Nainoa Thompson, one of the founders of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, in this picture with the bandana, also said, that there are levels of navigation that are in the realms of spirit. And I through going through neuroscience to anthropology to psycholinguistics, for my reporting for this book, found that to be one of the most, sort of marvelous aspects of this research and the learning that I was able to do. There's a lot of mystery, and as a science journalist, I love when science highlights all the things we don't yet know, the realms of the spirit. So with that, I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions that people have about this topic. I feel like I covered a fair amount, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Maura. As you finish up and you stop sharing your screen or whatever, I'll invite Kelly Carmine back on screen as well, and encourage the viewers out there to share some questions or comments that they might have while we get things started here. I want to thank you again for being here and for that fascinating presentation that laid out so much of your own wandering and exploration on this topic, and gave us a sense of how you as it were navigating between the anthropological element and investigating traditional practices, and then interrogating how and in what ways that has a connection to neurology and the ways that we think about our minds and what we know is going on in the brain. And have you and I'll confess that when you were showing that Matt through the maze image, that's how I felt during lockdown, going through the same sort of routines over and over again, and until I hit upon your book, and you, among other things, talked about how it's not just of course, part of human experience to wander far, but to notice things acutely and to pay attention in your own environment. And once you start doing that, things become meaningful for you in new ways. And so that was a particular experience that I had that I wanted to thank you for again, because we talked about this beforehand. But so much that you laid out there. And again, I'd like our viewers to share some questions if they have them, but also invite Kelly. I know that she probably has some questions or comments in mind. Would you like to share one, Kelly?
Sure. Maura, thank you so much. I've just like I said, I've just really enjoyed reading this book and hearing and even just admiring how you were able just in half an hour to summarize just some pretty dense, incredible information very, very quickly, and yet not shallowly. It even just the presentation, I believe, challenged me to think about my own life and my own relationship to where I am and what I do, and place it in a true cross-cultural position to other ways of moving about the landscape. And sort of one of the things that I particularly liked about your work is that you positioned us as in, Western and the weird societies, right? The Western industrial, educated, democratic societies, is that we are the anomaly here. We are the anomaly, that we are unable to navigate our world using whatever environmentally specific, relevant, conceptual tools of wind patterns in the Arctic, of wave swells in the Pacific, of just lichen patterns, the specificity of lichen patterns on rocks. And so I just loved all of that. I guess one of the sort of questions that came to me as I was listening and reading is, you mentioned about the Aboriginal woman in the blue dress in that photograph that you were speaking about, that she had never had, almost couldn't grasp the notion of having ever been lost. That's really interesting, because I've been lost 10,000 times. And yet you also, but we also know anthropologically, archaeologically, that Aboriginal people's territory has not been static over time. It has shifted all over the different desert systems. And so clearly they did regularly encounter new lands and new places that they didn't have either cognitive maps for or songlines for, whatever their sort of their traditional knowledge is centered on. They didn't have that. And so I guess I would just like to hear you talk about that philosophically. And then I'm thinking, well, if that's the case, maybe sort of like glottochronology, kind of like mapping or studying language to identify language change over time for when old words and then newer words. Mm-hmm. Well, could we do that with cognitive maps, or sort of is there deeper? Do you know where I'm going here? Is there deeper are there more song lines that center on older territory? I'm thinking of New Zealand now, and fewer song lines, or very different kinds of song lines that respond to far newer territories. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
it took a second to get all that out. Sorry.
Well, I don't know the answer to the last question you just posed about songlines. That sounds like a potentially incredibly fascinating, direction for research to go in. I think I spent a lot of time trying to read and think about what, early human history, what was the pace of exploration? We know that we originated in a place and have since come to occupy, every single niche possible in this planet. So how did that happen? And was it like, individuals who were making those leaps, or was it occurring generationally and more incrementally? So, were we sort of like astronauts, like going into the unknown constantly? And what would that experience have been like? And what strategies of navigation would we have been using if that were the case? Or is it establishing known places and then, over at a slower time scale, expanding those known places? But there is plenty of, archaeological evidence that there are cultures and periods in which humans were making incredible, traveling at incredible distances and paces, so that, especially in the Arctic, I talk a little bit about this in the book. There's some evidence that some of that quote unquote exploration would have been happening at a fairly quick pace. So how are people doing that? And I think memory is such an important piece of that puzzle, because, as long as you can find your way back from a place and you have the capacity to remember how to get back, you can go pretty far. And I think that the hippocampus and the evolution of this part of our brains, and the fact that humans, this is a really critical part of our brains. And when you look at its size and the number of cells compared to other species, it's clear that this is really important for us. How that developed and what it enabled us to do is a really fascinating story that is a little bit mysterious, because we don't have an archaeological record of the hippocampus. It's not possible to really know for sure. And yet it seems that, this capacity for memory and to recall events of the past, to imagine a future, to communicate that with others who then could share that vision of the future, or, follow a story of a place that someone had been to. All of those would have been extremely central to our development as human beings. Our ability to track animals and then, follow footprints back and to insinuate, like, what was this animal doing when it made these tracks? Where was it going? Why? If I follow them, how will I come back to, to home? So I think that, some of what you were raising is beyond my, ability to answer in this conversation, but all of those questions are questions that I was thinking of too. And I think were so captivating to me. I think some of those answers are in the book, but it's still, as far as I know, just an area in which we can only guess, and it's pretty exciting to think about.
If I can sort of, thank you, Kelly, for the question, and Maura for the answer. If I can kind of build on that, some of the ideas in both of your comments had to do with, on the one hand, patterns and repetitious movements and things that become very familiar. And on the other hand, movements into new territory, things that are novel and that test, our ability to navigate, to remember, to get there and back. And, this question of the ways in which, as Kelly was starting her comment, we sort of modernized, contemporary, westernized situations are forced from that. And, much of the traditional knowledge is a challenge to us. But also, I was reminded reading the epilogue to your book that you talk about how a lot of our own lives, we can look back to our childhood, right, and think about the our home range, I think you call it, right? And the degrees to which we either did or did not, and the same thing with our parents and grandparents, have the freedom, right, and have the practice of essentially creating our own personal, dreamscapes and songlines. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, what you were getting at in that last part of the book, and try to tie this together with this idea that our genius is topophilia, and that there's something in human nature that we need to, and that it may be being lost and chipped away at over, recent generations. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then thank you, everybody. I see there's a bunch of questions coming in. We'll get to those in a minute.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting aspects of the hippocampus that I became, fascinated by, and probably because I was a relatively new mom when I started writing this book, was the hippocampus in childhood. And a conversation that I had with a neuroscientist when I was trying to understand why it was that there was a period in my childhood where I had almost no memories. And then sort of around the age of 6 or 7, I still to this day can recall so much rich spatial, memory of the place that I inhabited and all the things that I did there. And almost as though my, memories, to use a kind of pathetic phrase, but came online or something. And she said, oh yeah, that's, childhood amnesia. Like everybody has that to some extent. And I didn't know that that was a thing that neuroscientists knew about, and that wasn't unique to me. So I began having conversations with people about why, what is it that, that's happening in our brains that as children, we're sort of these amnesiacs, like Henry Mullison. And part of the story seems to be that the hippocampus is in a process of development through our childhood. So we're not born with it. It sort of is trained and activated, so to speak, as we move through space. So, it became this really interesting thread in the book, just thinking about childhood and about, how the hippocampus becomes trained to quote unquote map space. And then I think also I began looking at some interesting sociological research that shows if you look at several generations, and this is sort of across the board, the studies have been done in Europe, they've been done in Japan, Australia, America, and you look at generations of a family, you can kind of see a shrinking of the space in which children are allowed to roam freely or to explore. So one of these studies looked at a grandfather who, they asked him how far could he go without asking his parents' permission, and it was something like 7 miles. And then the mother, his daughter, how far was she allowed to go? And it was a couple of miles. And then her son in this study was not able to go to the end of the block to the playground without asking permission. And so I was just really interested, what would the consequences of that be? Thinking about not just say our brain development, but also our attachment to the places that we live, and why would our freedom of movement and our autonomy to explore be important? And so I just started to have conversations with individuals who could help explain some of that to me, which I instinctively felt was, important, but it was great to be able to talk to others who see in this shrinking, something that's lost. And there's a whole other aspect that I didn't necessarily get into in this presentation, but just sort of neuroscientists who have studied the gray matter in the hippocampus. There's a famous study with London taxi drivers that a lot of people know of, where they looked at the hippocampus of these taxi drivers who have to have the knowledge, which is the streets of London, compared to control group, and seeing actual physical differences in the gray matter of the hippocampus. So it seems to be a thing that you like a muscle, that the more you use it, the more vigorous and healthy it becomes. And then also studies that are pointing to real disadvantages and consequences for not exercising that part of the brain. So connections to Alzheimer's, PTSD, depression. So, I think the childhood aspect of this became important to me because of some of those research findings, but also this idea of children as being particularly capable of forming attachments to place, and that is actually something that's essential for our development as human beings. And if that's not happening, then what does that mean, and how could we maybe fix that or create opportunities for it to happen?
You froze up on me personally
Yeah.
towards the end of your comment there. That's why I was out of it. I caught most of it though. And
Okay.
thank you. And Kelly, of course, stand by and chime in with a follow-up or another question at any point. But now that I'm back, let me bring in some questions from our viewers. And Alexandria asks, do you think that we carry a sense of knowing in our DNA from generations before us? Is there any neuroscience to support that idea?
I don't know. I think that becomes a really interesting question when you think about animal navigation. And there is a chapter dedicated to animal navigation in the book, because we actually are the only species, it seems, that really lacks this biological hardware that really lets us know exactly where we are all of the time, and allows us, to migrate. We don't have that in the way that animals do. We actually are sort of unique in our capacity to get lost. And so, whether or not certain species of animals know where to go as a result of their genetic inheritance of their DNA is just a really, I think it's a open question. And I think there is some evidence of that. I'm recalling like a study of birds that seem to indicate perhaps that, and yet again, as a science journalist, I just think it's amazing how little we do know about animal navigation. There are so many things that, even the idea of a magnetic compass, I started this book research thinking that had been kind of settled, and then realized that it's far from it. We still don't really understand, pigeon navigation, let alone whale navigation or Arctic tern navigation, like these journeys that take place across thousands of miles. It's just really incredible. So yeah, I don't know about the human sphere. I think we know a little bit more in the animal realm.
Viewers might be able to see just over my shoulder here a book called Super Navigators.
Oh yeah.
by one of our upcoming Chautauqua speakers. And I'll remind you of this as well. Maybe you can tune in at the time, Maura, on, I think it's going to be April 12th.
That's great. We were at the same animal navigation conference in England that's held every 3 years.
So you've met him. Great.
We were both working on our books, and our books came out around, I think, a similar time. So yeah. He's amazing. He goes into a lot of depth around this topic. It's great.
Great. So see everybody back here on April 12th for that. And Alexandria says, thank you for that answer. Let me grab another one. Stacy asks, or says, I've noticed with our youth a lack of spatial awareness. Would you say this is more cultural or neurological?
I think it's cultural. And I certainly heard that from many people. And yeah, I think I would say somewhat definitively that it's cultural. And for instance, one of the people I spoke to about David Lewis's research in Australia back in the 70s was anthropologist here in New York City who had traveled with Lewis on one of those trips, and has spent over 4 decades in the Central Desert in Australia. And he was explaining to me that kids as early as 7 or 8 have this capacity that they he would get lost going to places he had been before, and people would be shocked. They would say, "You've been here before," and he would say, "I know, but it looks exactly the same as many other places I've been, and I simply can't remember." And to them, it was just laughable. And there is a chapter in the book about psycholinguistics and this idea that if all of your language that you use to describe your spatial surroundings or to recount even a story, so grandma was sitting to the north of the TV, and so was sitting to the west of the TV, and then there was this really funny thing on the TV and everybody laughed, that you're encoding all of your information with these sort of cardinal directions. And they don't actually have a word for, say, left or right, which would be an egocentric perspective. Do those things make you an inherently better navigator? Well, the answer is yeah, pretty surely they do. If you are always having to orient yourself in space in order to speak, then you are going to be taking so many cues from your environment, and such a natural way of situating yourself and perceiving the world around you that it's pretty darn hard to turn that off and to become lost. So yeah, I think it's cultural. And I do think that smartphones are so convenient, so easy. I use them myself. I try to sort of limit my use of turn by turn GPS, but as a handheld map that situates you wherever you are in the world, it's just so powerful. It's quite a hard thing to relinquish, and yeah, I think there's a lot to be gained by doing that. So I don't know how to weigh in about the young folk out there, but I certainly think if that's what you're noticing, it's probably quite accurate.
You mentioned the idea of sort of instinctively being able to do things. That's related to a question that Fred asks. He says, I know some people can determine directions, north and south, et cetera, in a new location, apparently instinctively. What may be some clues that they're observing? Or I guess we could add, what else might be going on?
Yeah, I think, so the instinctive thing, I'm not sure I would use that term. There may be some evidence of that neurologically, that we have certain cells that seem to orient us, but not according to compass direction. So just making a little bit of a distinction there. But I think if you grow up doing this, it really does make a difference. Like, I've lived in New York City now since 2007. And when I come out of the subway, above ground, I will automatically orient myself according to the streets, which is really easy to do here because, especially in Manhattan, everything's oriented on a north-south and or east-west grid. But I'll definitely be like Hudson River here, East River here, and so I think depending on where you grow up, if you are taught to orient by the cardinal directions and you find devices by which to do that, it does become quite natural. And also I think it's a feeling that if that matters to you, then you will do it and you'll feel comforted by doing it. So I've also met people in the course of my research who absolutely could not do it even if they tried. And I met one man who was a professor at an Ivy League university, an incredibly educated man who was known to get so lost that his friends could hardly allow him to leave his hotel in a new city by himself because he might not be seen again for many, many hours. And I asked him why he thought that was, and he thought it was because the place that he grew up in was somewhat constricted, and there was a river and I think a mountain, and he always knew where he was to such an extent that he was never forced to find his way or to sort of, spatially figure it out. And so in a sense, he just felt like, well, this was something that he was never called to do it. So, now he's just hopeless. But there are conditions also that lead to that issue among people. And so not to make light of it, but it's I do think so much of it is culture and not much to do with instinct.
Thank you. Kelly, not Kelly Carmine, but another Kelly out there asks, the hippocampus is connected to emotional regulation and memory. Do you think that our over-reliance on GPS technologies has had a notable effect on emotional life in ways that are similar to memory?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's, very much hypothesizing. But what I would say is that if we're not exercising our hippocampus, if we're not sort of venturing into new experiences or places or I do think that would have emotional consequences. I can't say neurologically how that's all connected, but one of the researchers in the book who is quite amazing and is really a pioneer into looking at how hippocampal volume and whether we're exercising our hippocampus impacts us and its connection to different conditions and neurological conditions is Veronique Bobat in Canada. And she has found connections to stress, depression, PTSD, even alcohol abuse. And I think one of the more alarming ones is Alzheimer's disease. So she actually has created a sort of regimen for people who are interested in doing almost preventative exercises and work that would offset kind of neurological decline. And one of the things she says is just take walks. And that makes a lot of sense to me. There's been so much research that shows how just the act of walking and just even that kind of minimal physical exertion can lighten one's mood and can relieve stress, even 10 minutes they've found. And you could see how if you are walking in a relatively known space, but you take new routes within that space, even just walking around a museum, how that would sort of call on our hippocampus to become activated, how these things are connected. So I don't doubt that there's emotional consequences to not using it. I can't point to, a single study that proves it beyond a doubt, but it makes sense to me. So.
Thank you. As you were talking about that suggestion of just walking, I was reminded of, I think it was Thoreau, who wrote a great essay on walking and said, I don't, just recommend walking, but sauntering, because I don't actually know if this derivation is true, but he got the notion of saunter from scent terre, the idea of holy land, and somehow, that process has not just physical or physiological, but also mental and even spiritual value for us. And so, to go back, as Kelly asked earlier, and do some sort of philological research to see if we can find, earlier modes of wayfinding right in different traditions. Thoreau is perhaps a great person to take a look at for that. And it, also connects to something you talked about in your presentation that I guess I kind of wanted to ask you a little more about. this was when you were discussing Tim Ingold and his ideas about wayfinding as a process and adjustment. I think you talked about, constant adjustment and interaction. And you used the term inhabiting, right? That when we're in the world, we're inhabiting it. And that it's also kind of like a musical performance, this fluid kind of phenomenon. And that connects to, this idea of the plasticity of our brain that you also, of course, talked about quite a bit in the book. And that there's this constant looping that's going on and what have you. And, we're also organically connected. And, all of those things are so counter, as Kelly pointed out, and you mentioned in your talk, to, one of the prevailing notions that we have in the Western sort of technological mindset, which is that, we stand apart from the world. We control it precisely through whether it's the cognitive map or the GPS, but we control things, and in that sense, I don't just want to push this back to Descartes' mind-body distinction, but there's something about that, that also has been implicated in, the colonialist mindset, the imperialist mindset, this notion that human beings stand apart from and separate from nature, whereas, for our own well-being and indeed in our own, history, what we have typically done is inhabit it, right? We've belonged to it and in it. And so I guess I just wanted to ask for some more of your thoughts about that, and what else you would say, I suppose what you would recommend to people, in their own lives as ways of becoming better personal wayfinders.
Well, I think that if you look at the sort of academic lineage of this idea of wayfinding, and you go back, several individuals, what they're talking about is very much kind of contradicting the idea, going back to Descartes, of this separation between mind and body, and presenting a very, very different model for how we perceive the world, which also has to do with how we move through the world. So it's definitely, I would say, a more obscure group of thinkers, but those ideas have been out there, and a sort of descent to this, the common idea of how we perceive the world, and this sort of separation, which, I think when you were talking, Eric, I was just thinking more about connection and, walking, paying attention to our surroundings, observing. To me, one of the benefits of that is just, that feeling of being connected rather than disconnected from the spaces around us. And that has, I think, repercussions for so many other things. So, I mean, everyone that I spoke to in the places where I went, these are places where stewardship of the land is so critical, a relationship to the land and a sense of responsibility and caring for the land. And I think, it wasn't hard for me to see how navigation was at least a small part of that, because it forced one to pay attention, to be constantly observing and taking in information and thinking, well, why is it like that? What's changed? What's happening? From looking at animals to plants to movement of stars and all of it. And I think it really comes down to connection. And if we're, paying attention and connecting to our surroundings, I think that has, repercussions as well. And if we're not doing that, I think it is perhaps somewhat harder to feel that responsibility towards our surroundings. And perhaps, that explains a lot about some of the big problems and issues that are, so dire these days. So that is something that I thought about a lot, and have, I think, in my own experience as a person, also as a mother, trying to engender in even small ways practices of connecting, observing, paying attention to how I move through the world, and the choices that I make, are they for convenience, or are they for enrichment? Are they for necessity? Are they for adventure? I think about these things a lot, and I try to put myself in situations where convenience isn't always, the reason why I'm doing something. And I certainly, as a mom, try to put my kids in situations where they are called on to use skills, that maybe they won't necessarily need in the future, but will certainly make them, more interesting and better people, probably. I see Kelly's put up an orienteering club, which is something that I did for research of this book. And I brought my, at the time, 3-year-old out to do an orienteering exercise. And it's amazing. Even very young kids can have incredible spatial memory. It's really fun. And I even hosted an orienteering event at my kids' preschool one year. So that was really fun. And that's actually a big thing in Northern European countries. And there's a video game out there was created by a neuroscientist in London. And he uses the data that's generated by people playing this video game to try and understand differences between cultures and navigation skills, orienteering skills. And one of the things is, why are people in Northern Europe good at orienteering? And maybe it's because they have these orienteering clubs for young people, which is a big thing there.
Really cool. Thank you for sharing that suggestion, Kelly, and for all those thoughts, Maura. We're just about to the end of our time. Kelly, is there something else you wanted to say, add, or a question? Or your dog, you can introduce your dog too, if the doggy has a question.
This is Rusty. He's a toy poodle.
Hey, Rusty.
So orienteering, I did my college years in Canada, and it was a big thing in Canada. This is what we did for fun on the weekend, run with maps, through the woods and find these little punches, and it's just
great.
I just had no idea that it would be so much fun. So I'm also thinking, Maura, you must be familiar with that NPR radio program, Hidden Brain.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was thinking you need to do a show, an interview with that host.
Yeah, I should. I never thought of it, but I can't recall who the host is, but that's a good idea. You should be my my agent. Kelly.
Because he always has so many interesting, Hidden Brain, just how many interesting, just things are going on up there that nobody really knows about or thinks much about. And then it gets unpacked for you. And it's like, oh, wow, incredible.
Yeah, I think the hippocampus is one of the most interesting things I've ever, quote unquote, discovered as a science journalist. And like, I barely touched, the surface of everything that it does and how it operates in our life, probably. And, now this book came out in 2019. So probably from when I finished it to now, there's a whole host of like completely revelatory research that's been, come out since. It's really amazing. And I don't think, sometimes it seems that science limits, draws a perimeter around our world, but in this case, it feels like just opens up so many interesting possibilities and potential. And for me, it broadened my definition of what it meant to be human in a way that was comforting and exciting.
Thank you. And I agree. We should all write into Shankar Vedantam, who is the host of Hidden Brain, and suggest this topic. And then you can bring on Maura and our earlier speaker, Wade Davis, and even
Yeah.
Leanne Simpson we had on earlier this year, who talks about indigenous land-based practices in
Oh, wow.
education. So, we already have a whole program set for
Perfect.
Shankar Vedantam. So
Or
everybody
you
out there,
guys,
write in and let them know.
or you guys need a radio show. It
Or we
sounds
need a
like.
radio show, or to spin
Yeah.
off this into a podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, all great suggestions. And, we should probably wrap up here. I want to thank you, Kelly Carmine, for joining me on screen. Not for the first time either. And of course, Kelly was also a previous Chautauqua presenter herself in the past. And I want to thank the viewers out there and share their many compliments for you, Maura. Lots of thanks and compliments coming in, including what an amazing journey, very thought-provoking, and thank you very much, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the highest compliments you can get here at EKU Chautauqua from Heather McLaren, that Dr. Bruce McLaren, who is the founder of our series, would have loved this presentation.
That's nice.
Bruce sadly passed away this past year, but we, carry on his tradition here at EKU Chautauqua, and he would have absolutely loved this talk. The sense of wonder and exploration and challenging our assumptions and, a lot of the given practices, the things we take, for granted, the things we think are natural but aren't necessarily so.
That's so nice. Thank you.
So
I think
go ahead.
My own grandpa who passed would have been really impressed that I spoke at the Chautauqua series.
Well, we were delighted to have you, and passing along thanks from Jason and Lisa and Fred and so on. So we're going to go ahead and sign off now. You can hang on behind the scenes here, Maura and Kelly, for a minute. But everybody out there, have a great night. Have a great spring break, all you EKU colonels. And we'll see you back here at EKU Chautauqua next time. Don't forget to join us, especially for David Barry's presentation on animal super navigators on April 12th. You'll get reminders from me about that. So once again, thank you, everybody, and good night.